August 7th, 1977, a horrific crime occurred, later leading some inmates to commit one of the most forbidden acts in prison: snitching, as even the most fearless convicts draw the line at crimes involving children. So what exactly was this crime, and who was responsible for it? Here's what happens to members of Hell's Angels in prison. Number 8. Yves Trudeau. February 4th, 1946. A man named Yves Trudeau entered the world. Little did anyone know that he would later gain notoriety as the Apache, a feared outlaw biker and contract killer, earning his place among Canada's most infamous and prolific serial killers. Trudeau's journey to infamy began when he joined the Hells Angels and eventually rose to become their top assassin. He found himself caught up in various biker conflicts, including the Popeyes Devil's Disciples War, the Satan's Choice Popeyes War, and the Quebec Biker War. His descent into a life of crime was fueled by his addiction to cocaine and a growing paranoia that his fellow gang members were plotting against him. 1985, after the gruesome Lennoxville massacre, where 5 members of the Hells Angels North Chapter, co-founded by Trudeau himself, were brutally murdered. Trudeau made a surprising decision. He chose to become a Crown witness, providing crucial information about organized crime activities. In exchange for his testimony, he received a surprisingly lenient sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after just 7 years. In 1994, Trudeau was granted parole and given a new identity, Dennis Cote. However, his taste of freedom was short-lived, as he was arrested in 2004 for assaulting a boy, resulting in an additional 4-year prison sentence. Now imagine being in prison after committing 2 offenses that would make you a target amongst inmates: snitching and assaulting a child. I'm sure his time served was nothing short of horrible. In 2006, Trudeau was diagnosed with bone marrow cancer. He was transferred to a medical center, where he eventually passed away 2 years later. Number 7. Michael Langlois. September 8, 1983, Michael, a notorious Canadian outlaw biker, became the second national president of Hells Angels in Canada. His criminal journey began with the establishment of the Popeye Moto Club, quickly transforming into this criminal enterprise, collaborating with the Dubois brothers as assassins and drug dealers for the gang. The Popeyes, known for their excessive violence, eventually merged with the Hells Angels. Internal conflicts within Hells Angels in Quebec led to the division of the Montreal chapter into 2 factions: the Montreal North chapter, influenced by Langlois' connections with the Popeyes, and the disciplined Montreal South chapter. 1978 to 1984, a fierce battle unfolded between the Hells Angels and the Outlaws for control over Quebec. The assassination of Yves Piétot, the leader of the North Chapter in 1983, opened the door for Michael to become the national president for the Hells Angels. March 1985, the Lennoxville massacre became a turning point. Michael played a massive role as the North Chapter was wiped out, with 5 members ambushed and shot dead. Michael assisted in covering up the aftermath, disposing of the bodies in the St. Lawrence River. Later that same year, on his 39th birthday, Michael was arrested and faced charges related to that massacre. However, he managed to escape and fled to Morocco. After spending 2 years in exile, Michael surrendered and pled guilty to being an accessory to murder, serving a 2-year prison sentence. Yet his time behind bars didn't hinder his reign. Langlois, even while incarcerated, maintained control over the Angels, giving orders and arranging meetings. Upon his release is when the Quebec Biker War erupted, remaining the deadliest organized crime conflict in Canadian history. During this war, Michael emerged as one of the most prominent leaders of the Angels in Quebec. Later, Michael would leave the Montreal chapter to establish the South Shore chapter. Since none of the chapter members had any criminal convictions in the past 5 years, they managed to avoid being classified as a criminal organization under federal legislation. However, Langlois couldn't stay out of trouble for too long. 1998, Michael's associate, Robert Savard, got arrested for cocaine trafficking, which ultimately led to Michael's own arrest. He was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Now, after his release, Longa distanced himself briefly from the Angels, but soon enough he found himself face to face with Operation Shark, an investigation into the events of the Quebec Biker War. Michael had no choice but to admit his involvement in that war and pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder. As a result, he received a 9-month prison term in addition to the time he had already served. He was released from custody in 2015. However, that freedom didn't last very long. In 2018, he faced new charges related to drug trafficking, conspiracy, and gangsterism, leading to another 58-month prison sentence. This man requested parole many times, but the parole board denied it, partly because he continued to associate with the organized crime figures while in prison. 2021, finally, after serving 2/3 of his time, Michael was granted parole. However, the board imposed certain restrictions on him, such as prohibiting him from wearing the Hells Angels colors and from communicating with anyone involved in criminal activity or associated with a criminal organization until the end of his sentence. Considering his turbulent past of repeatedly going in and out of prison, he may find himself inside a cell in no time. Number 6. Caius Vovis. August 28, 2011 in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Tropical storm Irene was wreaking havoc. Roommates David Glasser and Edward Frampton, along with their friend Robert Chadwell, were held up in Glasser and Frampton's house, waiting for that storm to pass. Suddenly, 3 masked men barged in and abducted the 3 friends, and they were never seen again. Now, who were those 3 men and why would someone want to hurt these guys? Frampton was described as mildly mentally challenged, but he was an active man who loved playing basketball and participated in the Special Olympics. He was also a strong advocate for people with disabilities. Chadwell, a close friend of both Frampton and Glasser, worked as a counselor, helping teenagers deal with drug and alcohol issues. Glasser, on the other hand, was a popular handyman who had a passion for rock music and playing drums. Like Frampton, he faced some mental and physical challenges. But Glasser had a problem, and it would soon put all 3 of them in grave danger. 2009, Adam Lee Hall, a high-ranking member of the Massachusetts chapter of the Hells Angels, had lured Glasser to his place and brutally attacked him with a baseball bat. Hall believed Glasser stole a carburetor from him, which led to this violent act. Despite the risk to his own safety, Glasser went to the police to report the incident. 2 days later, the police arrested Hall not only for the assault, but also on charges related to drugs and firearms. Hall was scheduled to appear in court to face those charges, and Glasser was prepared to testify against him. However, before that happened, Glasser, Frampton, and Chadwell would never be seen alive again. After the storm finally passed, Erin Forbush, Frampton's disability caseworker, decided to check on him since she hadn't heard from him. To her surprise, she found the house empty, Glasser's truck still in the driveway, and the TV still blaring. What caught her attention was even more the untouched medications that Frampton took daily and his wallet left on the computer stand. Concerned, Forbush reported the 3 men as missing. The police, aware that Glasser was in danger due to his upcoming testimony against Hall, focused their investigation on him while continuing the search for the trio. 11 days later, the body of Glasser, Frampton, and Chadwell were discovered dismembered, wrapped in plastic bags, and buried in a pit. The police believed that Glasser was the intended target, while the other 2 unfortunate souls were simply at the wrong place at the wrong time. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Hall hadn't acted alone. 3 accomplices were identified: David Chalou and David Casey, both connected to the Hells Angels. However, it would be the 3rd accomplice who would turn the case into this international media frenzy. This 3rd accomplice was Caius Domitius Vovis, a self-proclaimed vampire and Satan worshipper. Roy Godfinski Jr. changed that name to Caius Vovis, inspired by Roman emperors Caligula and Nero. He transformed his appearance with facial tattoos, subdermal implants looking like horns, pointed ear implants, sharpened teeth, and a split tongue. His booking photo even had him wearing this large-gauge septum piercing and 2 smaller bridge piercings. Vovis's first brush with the law occurred when he was 13, and he was arrested for carrying a knife. At 19, he and his girlfriend were convicted in Maine for assaulting another girl. That disturbing act involving luring that girl into their motel room, where his girlfriend slashed her back with a razor. The victim would end up needing 32 stitches on that wound. Vovis received a sentence of 10 years for elevated aggravated assault and reckless conduct. He served only 7.5 years. Vovis was the last of 4 accomplices to go on trial. It was revealed that his motive for assisting Hall in getting rid of Glasser was his desire to join the Angels. However, Vovis pled not guilty on all counts, and his defense was actually pretty strong. There wasn't any physical evidence linking him to the victims or the crime. In fact, none of the weapons had been found. All the witnesses stated that Vovis wasn't present during any of the incriminating events. Also, Vovis's girlfriend provided him with an alibi for that night. Despite that, some witnesses confirmed that the 3 individuals were seen together the night before the murders. There was also some blood found in Vovis's car, although it couldn't be proven to belong to any of the victims. The prosecution also introduced knives, machetes, and diagrams of human dissections found in Vovis's apartment as evidence, claiming that he had a sick enjoyment for torturing and mutilating others. The jury took 37 hours spread across 6 days to reach a guilty verdict. He was given a mandatory sentence of life in prison with no chance of parole. When they announced his verdict in court, Vovis screamed,
"Every f***ing one of you, I'll see you all in hell."
Vovis is currently serving his sentence at the North Central Correctional Institution in Massachusetts. I'm not surprised that the jury literally judged Vovis based on his appearance. Who knows what'll happen to him in prison because of that? And now that we're done with Mr. Vovis here, let us shift our focus to the man who's calling the shots. Number 5. Adam Lee Hall. Adam Lee Hall, the Sergeant-at-Arms of the Manchester Chats chapter of Hell's Angels, emerged as the prime suspect for the triple murder of David Glasser, Edward Frampton, and Robert Chadwell. During the trial, Hall's girlfriend, Caitlin Carmen, revealed that she believed Glasser had single-handedly destroyed his life and future. Hall's inflated ego prevented him from comprehending that someone would dare to go against him, and so he intended to kill Glasser. Carmen admitted that Hall frequently made threats to harm others, but she never believed that he would actually follow through. However, a few days after the trio went missing, the bodies were discovered after David Casey struck a deal with the police and disclosed the burial location. Casey, a backhoe operator, couldn't bear the weight of that secret for too long, being the weakest link in that group. So Casey's testimony played a crucial role, ensuring that Hall and 2 other accomplices were sentenced to life imprisonment for murder, kidnapping, and witness intimidation. During the trial, another surprising revelation came to light about Hall. It appeared that he was willing to violate one of the Angels' sacred rules in order to save his own skin. September 2010, a police report claimed that Hall, in a desperate bid to avoid prison in the case where Glasser was supposed to testify against him, met with the FBI. He offered to assist federal agents in bringing down various Angels chapters along the East Coast. Hall proposed wearing a wire and providing info on the gang's involvement in drug dealing, firearms trafficking, and many other crimes. However, the FBI would turn down that offer, fearing that Hall was too dangerous and unpredictable to work with in that capacity. This rejection only fueled Hall's anger and determination to eliminate Glasser. Witnesses informed the state police that Hall had been discussing the need for Glasser to disappear before the trial, and he worked to make that happen. Now word quickly spread like wildfire in prison, and we can't help but wonder what happened to Hall after his fellow inmates, particularly his Hells Angels comrades, discovered his failed attempt to cooperate with the FBI. After all, everyone knows snitches get those stitches, and that's a cardinal rule in prison. Number 4. Zane Peora Wallace. Another type of prisoners others frown on are those who harm their loved ones, and this would apply to Mr. Zane Wallace. Now, what exactly did he do? July 31st, 2019. The sight of Jasmine Wilson in her hospital bed was heart-wrenching. It's hard to believe this same woman was once full of life. Covered in bruises from head to toe, her body resembled a canvas of black and blue. with many fractured ribs as painful reminders of this relentless beating she had endured for months. Tragically, just 2 days later, Jasmine's life support was switched off, marking the end of her painful journey. Now, you might assume that Jasmine had fallen victim to some sadistic murderer, kidnapped and tortured. Nevertheless, the person responsible for her torment was none other than her boyfriend, Zane Wallace. Mr. Wallace, a member of the Angels chapter in New Zealand, had a long history of violence. He has convictions for assaulting previous partners dating all the way back to 2014. The abuse inflicted on poor Jasmine by Wallace began long before her tragic murder. November 2018, during a drive in Wanganui, Wallace forced Jasmine to pull over, snatched her keys, and brutally beat her up. Little did she know that would be the beginning of this 9-month-long nightmare. During this period, Wallace repeatedly attacked Jasmine, leaving her physically and emotionally scarred, and his violence would extend beyond her, also assaulting one of Jasmine's acquaintances. Early 2019, Wallace spent a lot of time behind bars in 2 different prisons for many charges. Now, despite knowing that the calls in prison are recorded, he shamelessly made threats against Jasmine and her family on multiple occasions. He openly stated that he would slap, kick, and bash her, even went as far as to saying she was going in the ground, and described in explicit detail how he would kill her. July 30th, 2019. His threats proved to be true. The situation quickly spiraled out of control as he was punching Jasmine in the head. The violence would continue to the very next day, where he would attack her again, this time shoving her face very forcefully, smacking her head against the wall, causing her to lose consciousness. In a panic, he reached out for his father, and that's when things took this twisted turn. His father, Stephen Wallace, came to the rescue. He found Jasmine and quickly placed her in a car. He then collected Zane Wallace's mother, Leanne, who wasted no time reaching out to Zane's sister, Stevie Lee. However, the trio worked tirelessly trying to conceal any evidence of where Jasmine was found and how she was taken to the hospital. They were determined to throw the police off their trail. Stevie Lee would even go as far as to give the hospital staff different stories about how Jasmine got her injuries, in this attempt to mislead the police investigation for a while. But despite the family effort, justice caught up with Zane. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 15 years and 6 months. Number 3. Jonathan Nelson. Laconia Motorcycle Week is an awesome annual motorcycle rally taking place in Laconia, New Hampshire. This rally has a super interesting history dating back to 1916, starting out as a motorcycle gypsy tour. June 2014, things would get pretty intense during this event. Joel Silva, a Hells Angels Sonoma charter member, found himself in a heated argument with a fellow member from Massachusetts. On top of that, he was also accused of bad-mouthing Jonathan Nelson, the president of the Sonoma charter. Well, Nelson wasn't too happy with that disrespectful behavior, and he, along with Brian Wendt, the president of the Fresno chapter, and Rusty Ott, a former president and highly respected member of the Sonoma charter, whom Silva trusted, decided that enough was enough. They believed Silva was causing too many problems for the chapter and had to be dealt with. So Nelson made arrangements with Rusty to have Silva taken care of in Fresno. July 15, 2014, Rusty would take Silva to Fresno, where Wendt was waiting for him. Now Silva and Wendt had a rocky history, and Silva knew that he'd probably have to duke it out with Wendt to resolve his issues with the club. Nevertheless, he agreed to travel with Rusty to Fresno. But as soon as they would get to that clubhouse, Wendt would shoot Silva right in the head. A day later, his body was taken to a local crematory and incinerated, while his truck was also set on fire. For 8 long years, Silva's family had no clue about what happened to their beloved Joel, until a breakthrough occurred in this investigation. Merle Hefferman, a well-known member of the Fresno chapter, was famous for organizing charity events for children. However, prosecutors uncovered this horrifying truth. He regularly turned victims into ashes in a funeral home nicknamed the Pizza Oven. One of those victims was none other than Joel Silva. After a 10-year investigation into racketeering, Hefferman was finally convicted of using a crematory to dispose of a fellow member's body. He was sentenced to 4 years in jail. The investigation also led to the arrest of Jonathan Nelson, Rusty Ott, and Brian Wendt. 2022, their trial finally took place. The trio was found guilty of Silva's murder, and as a consequence of their despicable crime, they were sentenced to life in prison. Locked away behind bars, they serve as a chilling reminder that even within the close-knit brotherhood of the Hells Angels, betrayal and vengeance have no limits. Number 2. Paul Aish. By day, this man was a well-groomed, smartly dressed Arizona stockbroker. But when he ditched that suit and tie, Paul here transformed into one of America's most dangerous criminals, getting him a spot on the U.S. Marshals 15 Most Wanted list. October 27, 2001, the club was hosting its regular church meeting, as they like to call it, and this gathering always took place at the Mesa, Arizona clubhouse. According to a former member, once that door was locked, the Angels got out and fine-tuned their illegal schemes, including selling methamphetamine. On that fateful night, Cynthia Garcia decided to hang out at that clubhouse. Little did she know it would be her last night out. As she partied with these Angels, the 44-year-old mother of 6 started bad-mouthing the club and its members, running around all drunk with no filter, making the Hells Angels pretty mad, so they began brutally beating her. They would mercilessly stomp on her while she lay defenseless on the clubhouse floor. Eventually, they would throw this semi-conscious woman into a trunk of a car and drive off into the vast Arizona desert. Her lifeless body was discovered on Halloween. This woman had been stabbed nearly 30 times, and her killers attempted and failed to decapitate her. 2 years after this murder, a federal investigation known as Operation Black Biscuit stormed into the Mesa chapter of the Hells Angels. Over a dozen members would get federal criminal charges, including drug trafficking and a conspiracy. The investigation would lead to 2 Angels involved in Garcia's case, one of whom was Paul Aish. Despite the seriousness of the charges, the judge granted Aish bail. His stable job as a stockbroker and relatively clean criminal record seemed to influence this decision. However, Paul had other plans and wasn't interested in sticking around for his day in court. July 29, 2004, Aish mysteriously vanished into thin air. That morning, he slyly removed his ankle monitor, bid a farewell to his girlfriend, and made a daring escape from the country with assistance of a fake passport provided by fellow Hells Angel Robert Eugene Tudeki. This former stockbroker turned gang member managed to elude capture for an impressive 7 years, until Argentinian authorities finally arrested him in Buenos Aires in 2011. During his arrest in possession, the Argentinian officials found a passport, an Arizona driver's license, and even a social security number, all belonging to Tudeki. To everyone's surprise, a Change.org petition emerged, urging for Aish to remain in Argentina rather than be extradited to the U.S. The petition argued that Aish had a wife and son in the country, and claimed that he would face unjust charges if he were to be extradited. Despite amassing over 4,000 signatures, the petition ultimately had little to no impact on the final decision. 2018, Aish would return to Arizona in handcuffs and would finally face the music for his involvement in Garcia's murder. And number 1, Otis Buck Garrett. August 7, 1977, as the sun dipped behind Bald Peak, a small mountain overlooking the Oregon village of Laurelwood, Bonnie Sleeper arrived at her friend Margot's house. Even before she reached the front step, a sense of unease washed over her. Something was definitely wrong. Finding the front door locked, but hearing the blaring sound of rock and roll music from inside, Sleeper decided to try the back door. To her surprise, it swung open effortlessly, and she was stunned by what she saw. 2 lifeless bodies sprawled on the living room floor. One was her 24-year-old friend Margot Compton, and the other was Sleeper's fiancé, Gary Sessler, who was only 19. The tragedy would continue. As police secured the crime scene and searched the house, they made a horrifying discovery. Margot's twin little girls also had been fatally shot. This heinous crime would lead to a shocking turn of events within prison walls, as several convicts would break the ultimate taboo, snitching on each other. But before we get into that, let's focus on the man who orchestrated it all. If notoriety had a face, it would belong to Otis "Buck" Garrett, once the president of the Vallejo chapter of the notorious Angels motorcycle gang. Garrett had a reputation for violence. Even the most audacious members of the gang drew a line when it came to harming children, but not Garrett. Now, his reign of terror began after the death of Harry the Horse Flamberus, who served as president of the San Francisco chapter. Now, as the gang's leader, Harry opposed involvement in prostitution and drug trafficking, much to Garrett's displeasure. Unfortunately for Garrett, he couldn't take action as long as Gary was alive, since the gang only answered to him. January 6, 1977. Tragedy struck when Harry was brutally murdered at his home. He and his girlfriend were shot in the head, and the killers made off with cash and drugs. It was evident that this was a targeted hit, and the fact that the case remains unsolved suggests the involvement of rogue factions within the gang. Garrett, being one of those prime suspects, wasted no time in steering the Angels towards prostitution and drug trafficking after Harry's death. At the time of his arrest, Garrett was believed to be running the largest methamphetamine manufacturing and distribution network in the U.S. Now, he couldn't have done this without the extensive network of the Hells Angels, which he utilized to distribute drugs and carry out various illicit activities, including the murder of Margot Compton. Now, Margot began working at a massage parlor in San Francisco that was owned by the Hells Angels. Unfortunately, she found herself in a difficult situation, where she had to perform sexual acts on patrons to repay a debt for methamphetamine that was given to her by none other than Garrett. Things got uglier when Compton was beaten and violated by one of the patrons. This prompted her to contact law enforcement, leading to Garrett being indicted on felony morality charges. July 1977, Compton bravely testified on behalf of the prosecution in a California state criminal case. She revealed that she and 4 other women working at that parlor were being pimped out by the Angels. She also said that the operation had the protection of 2 corrupt San Fran Police Department Vice Squad officers who were bribed with cash and favors. After her testimony, Compton decided to flee to a cottage in Gaston, Oregon, where she, her twin daughters, and Gary Sessler, the son of her boyfriend, were all shot dead. It was later discovered that Garrett was the one who ordered these brutal killings, but this info came to light 18 years later. 2 Angel members who were already serving time in prison started bragging about the crime, causing the news to spread like wildfire. The revelation shocked everyone, even the prisoners. It seems that there is a line most gang members don't dare to cross, and that is harming innocent children. Garrett's actions were so heinous that several inmates, including some members of the Angels, did something they would typically avoid, and that would be to testify on one of their own. Garrett, along with other members of the club, were disavowed by the organization due to the involvement in the murder. Before his trial in Oregon, Garrett was already serving a life sentence in Lompoc Federal Prison in California for narcotics offenses. During that trial, Garrett would be handed 4 consecutive life sentences, and he remained incarcerated until his passing.